Okay, it's now the end of the 7 p.m. turn, and the Russians haven't given up yet, although they probably should. They've launched another series of assaults. First of all, the Russians, first of all, there's a regroup chit drawn. So the French hussars tried to move towards who is this? Sorry, I've forgotten. Claparade to regroup. They couldn't get far. And the Avant Guard had the next activation, and the Cossacks attempted to move around and charge the rear of those hussars. Unfortunately, they failed their morale check to do so. The Cossacks are required to pass morale check to charge. They failed, and so didn't do anything. So the French hussars breathed a sigh of relief there. Then the Russians launched an assault on the square here, and they launched another series of assaults down here. 3 battalions heading in against that French square. This is pretty bad. They failed two of their roll to close, despite coming from a fair distance away. But they did reasonably well in the assault and disordered those French defenders. Having said that, Russians still are suffering heavier losses in these fire exchanges due to French artillery and more effective French fire. And another Russian unit has routed away from this area. So the Russians, they're not giving in yet. They're still giving it a go. But they have suffered some horrendous losses. They have some battalions down to 1 increment. I mentioned earlier they've lost 1 battalion. Whereas again, the French, this square here only has, I think, 3 increments left. These guys, there's some infantry under here. They have, I think, 2 or 3 left. But most of the remaining French battalions are close to full strength. And of course, the 100th Line Regiment behind the lines just hasn't even joined the fight yet. So the fight continues, and you can see here some of these Russians have pulled behind the line. They are very low as well, down to 2 or 3 increments, and not wanting to exhaust themselves any further. So that's the end of the 7 o'clock turn. We're heading into 7:20 p.m. now. All right, we're now at the end of the 7:20 p.m. turn, and a lot of action around here. You may recall the Russians launched 3 battalions at this French square. They did disorder that square, which put that French artillery in a vulnerable position out here. And to try to save their surrounded artillery, the French 100th Line Regiment launched 2 counter-assaults. One drove through here and the other in here. And they were very successful, and they routed both of those Russian units that were disordered. Further fighting, I think due to fire combat here, disordered another Russian unit in the area, which means that the Russians have lost a large part of their right flank out here. And if we just pan up a bit, you can see a few of those routed Russian units off in the background. The Cossacks have pulled around. The Russians had one of the last activations for the turn, so the Hussars pulled back across the bridge here to safety, and the Cossacks pulled back around to the north side of the fighting round here. The Russians advanced, prolonged their artillery up here to get close to this French square, but the square pulled back a little bit further. Other than that, the French disordered in the centre here, and more Russian casualties. I think the Russians might pull back now. It is not looking good. Now that the French are feeling confident enough to counterattack, I think it's fair to say that the Russians should save what they have left for the coming days of fighting. This unit here down to 2 increments. I'll just show you some of the strengths here. Down to 2 increments. These guys at the back down to 2 as well. These guys I think have 3. They're at 50% strength in most places along the line. 4 routed units in the background. There are some French. There's a French battalion out to the right of this image that has rallied and is coming back into the fighting. Still, some very strong units. These guys have 8 increments. Again, the 100th Line Regiment, which assaulted there, they both disordered, but they suffered no casualties in the fighting. So they're still at full strength. I think it's time for the Russians to pull back. So we'll do that over the coming turn. I'm pretty sure I'm making a decision here for the Russians to stop attacking and losing their men. We'll see how that works out. Okay, we're now at the end of the 7:40 p.m. turn. Now the Russians have disengaged from the French. They've done pretty well in passing morale checks to just withdraw from the fighting. Cossacks holding out in the right wing here. And wow, the big thing here, you may notice a big space here where the Russian artillery was. The French artillery launched, like I said, a counter battery fire on the French, on the Russian guns. They rolled a 66, which, if I understand it correctly, eliminates the entire Russian artillery counter. Correct me if I'm wrong there, but yeah, whenever artillery fires on artillery units, there is a chance of explosion if the result is a natural 66. So it says the artillery counter is eliminated. Bye-bye Russian artillery. Wow. They had been very effective. They'd been doing some nice hits here. You can see they're down to half strength on the 45th Line Infantry Regiment there. Elsewhere, the Russians suffered another hit on the skirmishers, which is pretty lucky of the French. They're down to 2 increments. And yeah, that's about it. Just the Russians pulling back. The French were disordered around here, so they couldn't do a lot. They've rallied very well and may be in a position to threaten the Russians if they want to attack. I mean, they've got Cossacks right in front of them, so it's a bit dangerous. But if they want to do that, I think they're in a position where they have now numerical superiority. It's certainly artillery superiority over the Russians. So the Russians certainly want to get out of there pretty quickly. All right, that is the end of the 7:40 p.m. turn. We are now just on 8 p.m.